Well, hello and welcome to the AALS Teaching Methods section webinar. Our topic today is on busting the myths around learning styles and discussing whether and if differentiated instruction can and should play a role in the law school classroom. I am Jeff Minetti. I have the privilege of serving as Assistant Dean for Academic Excellence and Bar Success at Seattle University School of Law. I'm joined as a co-moderator with Cindy Archer. Cindy, would you introduce yourself to the group?
Thank you, Jeff. I'm Cindy Thomas Archer. I'm a professor of lawyering skills at University of California, Irvine School of Law, and a member of the board of the Teaching Methods section of AALS. And I'm very, very excited to be a part of this program. Thanks, Jeff.
We have two panelists, and we want to shift to them just as quickly as we can to get their thoughts. I'll introduce Chris. So panelist Professor Chris Franklin earned her JD from New York University Law School, her BA from Yale. She currently serves as the Wallace Stevens Professor of Law and Director of Academic Initiatives at New York Law School. Her courses are a mix of first-year and upper-level courses, doctrine and skills. She teaches tort, contract to first-year students, family law practice, and advanced legal methods, principles of legal analysis. Just as she teaches widely, she's published widely on an array of topics. Her recent articles have looked at problem resolution lawyering across the curriculum, casting light on those with lived experiences that are otherwise invisible to the law and to legal pedagogy. And on legal pedagogy directly, she's written about directed questions, a non-Socratic conversation about non-Socratic teaching. In 2019, she published a book that, in my judgment, reflects great foresight. It's about legal reasoning case styles, contemporary approach to attorney methods. Chris is co-founder of the Association of Academic Support Educators, which is the context in which I met her. In 2023, she received the AALS section on Academic Support's Legacy and Leadership Award. That award is given out to a senior member of the discipline who has made outstanding contributions to the academic support profession throughout their career. Chris, thank you for taking time to join us today. I know you are literally between classes. I so appreciate your presence here with us.
Thank you. That's an embarrassingly flattering introduction, but thank you.
And thank you. I'd like to introduce to you our second panelist. Karen Snedden is Interim Dean and Professor of Law at Mercer University School of Law. Dean Snedden joined the Mercer community in 2006. She graduated summa cum laude from Louisiana State University and Tulane Law School. Before becoming a faculty member at Mercer University School of Law, she was a Forrester Fellow at Tulane Law School. She has been a visiting professor of law at the William S. Boyd School of Law at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas, and taught a short course in comparative succession at ELTE Law, another university in Budapest, Hungary. Forgive me, I wasn't going to torture that name. Before serving as interim dean, she serves as associate dean for faculty research and development. She teaches legal writing, wills, trusts and estates, and real estate transactions. She has received twice the Reno Cossack Excellence in Teaching Award. In 2021, she received the 2020 Teresa G. Phelps Scholarship Award for Legal Communication for her article, Clause A to Clause Z, Narrative Transportation and the Transactional Reader, written with Professor Susan Chesler and co-recipient of that award. In addition to authoring law review articles and essay, Dean Snedden co-authored the Moot Court Workbook with Professor Sue Painter-Thorne, and Dean Snedden has also co-authored Experiencing Trust in the States with Professor Deborah Gordon, Professor Carla Spivak, and Professor Allison Tate. Dean Snedden has also contributed a rewritten judgment to Feminist Judgments Rewritten Trust and Wills Opinions. And then since 2008, Professor Snedden has co-authored with Professor David Hrysick the regular column Writing Matters for the Georgia Bar Journal. She is an active member of the Legal Writing Institute, Association of Legal Writing Directors, and the Southeastern Association of Law Schools. And thank you so much for interrupting your very busy schedule to be a part of our meeting today.
Oh, I'm really delighted to be here. I want to thank the moderators, my fellow panelists, AALS, and all of you for taking time today so that we can share with and learn from each other.
Thanks, Dean Stetton. So our game plan for today, I'm going to pose a series of discussion questions from the panelists and listeners. Some of those, at a couple of points during the conversation today, I'll turn to you with similar questions and look for your responses in the chat. Cindy is going to be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation, and we plan to reserve the last 15 or so minutes of today's session for listeners' questions of the panelists, and then a brief reflection exercise at the end of the hour. So let's jump in and get started. Panelists, where are you physically today?
I'm in New York. I'm in my office. I'm delighted to be back in my office since I finally learned how to work at home during COVID. And I guess that's an advantage because I now enjoy working at home, but man, I'm happy to be back. Also, it's a gorgeous day in New York right now.
Nice. Dean Stetton?
Well, when I first looked at this question, I was thinking literally, like physically where I am at week 12 in the semester. A constant state of anxiety is what I was thinking about. But I'm here in Macon, Georgia at Mercer University School of Law. We're celebrating our 150th anniversary this year.
Sweet. Nice work. Congrats on that. Can you briefly tell us about one thing today that has brought you personal or professional joy?
I guess I'll go first, which is that my students, oh my God, I was worried about how I was going to get to this thing because I am covering the introduction to personal jurisdiction today. And it may strike one or two people that that's a fairly complex topic. And so I had no idea how I was going to get everything wrapped up in order to get here on time. I was able to end class early. And I even had them doing an activity that they did a phenomenal job in. They understood the material. They had done the reading in a week in which their briefs are due in their legal practice class. And I was able to say, you know what, guys, I don't need to hold you in class longer. If you've demonstrated that you've understood today's material, that is an awesome feeling.
Yeah, well, like Chris, I'm coming right from class. It's week 12. For many of you, it's week 12 or 13. You know, that sense of looking forward with, I'm going to say enthusiasm, a few students, not so much. But at the end of class, someone came up to me and said, you know, I really appreciate that we learn something every class meeting. And I thought, check the box. That's exactly what I want to hear. So I appreciate that.
Nice. So a few weeks ago, when I reached out to you about this topic, I'm curious about what busting myths around learning styles resonated with you. What about this topic interests you specifically? Dean Stetton, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, I have grown up in higher ed, and I have always wanted to be a professor because education is empowering. And to think of really the great trust that we have been given by our students, by our institution in that facilitating of learning, and that idea that we're always learning ourselves, that we're always refining the approach, that's what's really drawn me to this particular topic, but that's what's kept me happy in higher education.
And Professor Franklin, how about you? Learning styles, what appeals to you about that topic?
What appeals to me about this topic is actually far more than learning styles. Dean Stetton's work on differentiated instruction. In some ways, I feel like learning styles is a kind of, it's a useful framework, but it's a sort of dated framework. And it's, you know, it tends not to be where the debate is. I read everything I get my hands on, both in law and outside of law, about learning theory. I've read a lot of the material that people have written on it. Some of it, to my mind, involves disagreements about stuff that I don't think we actually firmly disagree about. And so I'm far more interested in what we can all gain from Dean Stetton's work and everybody else's on how do we reach each student, because every student is an individual in our classes, every single one. That doesn't mean that we have to have 100 different teaching methods if we have 100 different students, but it does mean that we have to make sure that 100 different people are learning. And that is a very complex thing.
Well said. Dean Stetton, if you could, would you offer up a definition of learning styles that we could work with today? Because we're going to be critiquing that topic from a couple of different angles.
Yeah, to me, it's so difficult to talk about learning styles because I think the phrase really for me is learning preferences or learning habits, because every day we engage in learning, whether we are formally the student or the teaching, and we develop habits and patterns about how we engage with material, how we process information, how we retain and recall it. And as Professor Franklin was saying, learning styles becomes a real shortcut way to say what we are doing when we're sort of processing information or what we would like to process information. I think if we identify too closely with learning styles and we can get too bogged down in that language, it almost really helps us miss the point. As Professor Franklin said, it's about how do we engage with our learners, and that style becomes proxy for a lot of different things that I would kind of posit are more like learning preferences or habits that we've developed over time.
Thanks. Professor Franklin, anything to add to that definition or?
Yeah, I mean, some of the work that I've read, and I'm assuming that many other people who are here in this webinar have read, makes it clear that I think we should all agree there are genuine differences in how people learn. There are genuine differences in how people approach material. Some of those things have to do with just sort of, the things that are true about how our brains work. But some of those things are also due to external factors that include our preparation for law school, that include factors that may alienate some people more than I want to be clear that I think the law school experience is deeply alienating for virtually everyone, but it is not equally alienating for everyone. And that it is certainly true that some people particularly are primed to thrive in those environments in ways that other people are not primed to thrive in those environments. So it's absolutely true that our teaching methods need to reach all of those people.
Appreciate that. Dr. Carol Hendrick has addressed the myths around learning styles in an article that he wrote that says learning styles don't exist. Now, I'd like to share a summary of that and some quotes from the article and get your reaction, panelists, to it. He notes that there is an intuitive appeal to learning styles theory because the theory seems self-evidently true. Many people will say they cannot learn by listening to a lecture, or that they learn by doing, or that they need to move around and listen to music while studying. Others contend that they are verbal learners who learn best through reading or listening to an audiobook. But Hendrick argues that there is simply no credible evidence to support the idea that attending to learning styles actually supports learning. He cites a 2016 study that tested whether visual learners learned better when presented with material in the form of pictures or words, and whether verbal learners learned better when the material was presented as words versus pictures. Although the visual learners left feeling more comfortable and confident with the content, and the verbal learners felt more confident studying words, the researchers actually found no difference in the learning preferences of the groups for the different kinds of material. Hendrick also expressed concerns about the reliability of learning styles assessments, noting that research suggests that an individual's learning style is not stable enough to warrant directing educational instruction to it. And finally, he noted a 2008 study completed by the Association for Psychological Science, which looked at whether teaching according to the principles of learning styles improves learning and educational outcomes. He stated, the answer is a resounding no. The study concluded that at present there is no adequate evidence to justify incorporating learning styles assessments into general education practice. Thus, education resources should be better directed to adopting other educational practices that have a strong evidence base. So, based on that information and others that you've heard from Dr. Hendrick, panelists, what's your reaction to Dr. Hendrick's premise that learning styles don't exist? And to cue you up, how about Dean Snedden? Would you like to start?
Okay, I didn't know if we were switching back and forth with questions. So yeah, Jeff and Cindy, you direct me wherever you would want. I think this interest in learning styles and the appeal of the learning styles in some sense goes to kind of why we're in education. We want to help every single student learn. And so we are looking for not a magic code exactly, but we are looking for a way to reach different learners at different points in their learning path. And it gives us some type of framework. It's almost becomes shorthand for us to think about how do we recognize the differences in learning as we are working towards the same goal. So I think it has a lot of appeal, but as I said before, I think it really more, we develop preferences and habits, and even people who would say, I'm a visual learner, there are times where they learn in another way, or they should be stretched to learn in a different way. But the reason we like to talk about it, to me, is why we're great educators, because we want to find that way to connect with an entire class of students.
Appreciate that. Professor Franklin, what can you add?
Maybe you don't want us to get personal, but I'll just say that there was a time, I can't remember when it was, maybe 15 or 18 years ago, when and I've been teaching for quite a while at this point. I was on the job market for something, and I swear to God, I can't even remember precisely with whom I was interviewing, but I essentially got the job offer in one question. And they told me that later, that I got the job offer in one question, because they said to me, well, what is your teaching philosophy? Oh my God, I didn't know I needed to have one. Okay. I said, my teaching philosophy is a combination of Tony Amsterdam and Vernelia Randall. For people who are not familiar with it, one of those, Tony Amsterdam was a now retired, legendary in terms of putting together both lawyering skills and deep intellectual content. Vernelia Randall, also retired. The thing that she taught me most was, I remember watching her at a conference stand up at one point and say, I am tired of my white students being the standard, the same way that like men are the standard for medical tests, and then we figure out later if the medicine we've already approved works on women. I'm going to focus on what works for my Black students. And if things work for my Black students, I'm going to assume they work for my white students. And that, that was a long time ago. And it really stuck with me, because one of the things it taught me is that, yes, our students are different, although they're not all equally different, and they're not all different in precisely the same way. So one of the things that I care about a lot is what is working for a lot of students. And if it's not working for a lot of students, how can I reach the ones it's not working for? That's what I hope we can talk about. Learning styles itself, I'm not very interested. I'm sure that Professor Hendrick is right about some stuff, but I also know that like there's been a replication crisis in social science for the last 25 years. And yet I would like social science to continue to exist. And if we're concerned about the replication in crisis in social science, it might equally apply to Professor Hendrick's work if we take a closer look at it, or to mine, or to anybody else's. Changing ideas is not bad. It's what the academy is about. At the same time, overstating ideas is a problem. Learning styles itself, to my mind, is not, I don't find it a useful framework. I find differentiated instruction a much more useful framework. But the one thing I do know about is that it taught us all to pay attention to differences among students. And I find some value in that, irrespective of whether you want to reject or agree. A lot of the literature of people who've been writing about this stuff is disagreeing about nomenclature. And that is just not a thing that I'm interested in. Because what I am interested in is the idea that, for example, one of the things that that I learned from also now retired Marty Peters, who was, when I first started some of the work I do, one of the fashions was everybody was going to do Myers-Briggs or BART testing. That's kind of fallen by the wayside right now. But there's some value to it, because one of the things it taught me most was there are people who approach law from big picture to working down to details, and there are people who approach it from details to working up to big picture, and that's a real thing. And when I started looking for that, I saw it everywhere. And I also saw that good lawyers need both, and that Marty Peters' position, which was, it doesn't matter which one you enter from, you just have to know where your strengths and weaknesses are, and make sure that you capitalize on your strengths, but teach yourself your weaknesses. That's a value. But it's also true that coming from a big picture and missing the details is deadly in law. Coming from the details and missing the big picture is a problem, but not quite as deadly. So there are differences there, but they're not equal differences, right? And we have to figure out how to help students navigate both of those things.
Appreciate those thoughts, Professor Franklin. This next question gets to some of the tension that exists in alternative approaches to the law school classroom. There is one approach that says we should look at each individual and find ways to teach to that particular individual's learning strengths and weaknesses. By better seeing and more clearly seeing and better understanding the students, we can better teach the students. An alternative approach says, no, that's not the way to go. Instead, focus on the common features among all learners. For example, recent cognitive science literature tells us in texts like Make It Stick that things like spaced repetition, retrieval practice, interleaving assessments, feedback accompanying with assessments are all things that help all learners learn, and that should be the thrust of our teaching. So my question for you two is, as you approach preparing for class, which approach for you is your dominant approach? How are you conceptualizing the way that you approach your class preparation?
Can I jump in on that one? One of the things I taught my children when they were young was that this is going to be our family philosophy. Never or when you can and. And it feels to me like a lot of the debate here is about oring, and everything we know about good learning is about anding. You know, it's always helpful to use multiple modalities to learn and to think. There's a lot, some of the the matching hypothesis it does seem to sort of lack support. The idea that, you know, I'll give you an example. I got an email just recently from a student, not in one of my classes, but who was in a course that was using a textbook that I had written, saying to me, I'm a visual learner, so could you provide me with an example of the thing that I need to write? And I was like, well, first of all, no, that won't be happening. And secondly, that's not what visual learning means, and you don't understand what visual learning means, but I don't need to have that debate with you because with C number one, no. But, you know, there is a difference between how adults manage learning and what you might want to do for kids. You know, I do get the idea that, for example, kinesthetics might be really valuable for all fourth graders, but uniquely for fourth graders who have a hard time sitting still and concentrating. That's a very different thing from adults who have learned how to learn and are adapting to learn in a different way. So in that way, I think that we can have different expectations in andragogy than what we simply get directly from pedagogy, although I think everything that we learn from pedagogy is useful and valuable. But at the same time, I also think there's nothing that says doing everything the same way is ever a good thing for anyone.
Appreciate those thoughtful comments. Dean Snedden, your thoughts?
Well, you know, I think Professor Franklin really summed it up. You know, I really like that idea of both and to me, when I think about it, learning is a shared responsibility. So as the educator, I have a certain responsibility every time I go into the classroom, every interaction that I have with the students. But you know what? The learners have a responsibility to themselves as well as to each other. And as we kind of form that community, we realize that we bring with us a lot of different things that really complement the community. One thing I love most about legal education is there's no one path into legal education. So we will always have varied students, varied interests, because there's no one path out of law school. And that to me is what makes our classrooms so rich. And the need for us, as Professor Franklin has said, to recognize both the differences and the similarities. And as we're doing everything from our learning contract that's called a syllabus to thinking about the summative assessment, we are trying to structure that community that we are all in it together, and we're all going to get to hopefully the same destination.
Nice. In your article, Dean Snedden, Square Pegs and Round Holes, Differentiated Instruction in the Law School Classroom, you define differentiated instruction and assert that adapting to the needs of learners is what effective and efficient educators should do. We've been batting that phrase around a bit already today, differentiated instruction. Dean Snedden, can you offer up a definition for folks who are hearing that for the first time?
Sure, and I'm going to draw heavily from Carol Ann Tomlinson, who wrote a number of books, including The Differentiated Classroom, Responding to the Needs of All Learners. And what that really posits is that our responsibility is to engage students who are going to have a range of learning readiness. Now, that's not just kind of looking at their entering statistics, but that's recognizing all their prior academic and non-academic experiences that have put them where they are today. So it's kind of their starting point. It also recognizes that they're varying learning profiles, and that can be some of their preferences and habits. It can also be some of their experiences, and that they will have differing interests in our topics and in the course. In order to engage all of those, what we then need to do as the educator is we need to shape the content. That's the information that the learners are going to learn. We need to think about the process. That's the instructional methods that we're going to use. And we need to think about the product. What is the mechanism by which students are going to go ahead and demonstrating the learning? Differentiated instruction, or differentiated in learning, as it's sometimes called, is not about teaching a topic 100 different ways, but it is recognizing that not everyone is at the same place and is looking to go to the same destination. So how do we bring them together in that community? And what is really our responsibility, especially as it relates to content? Again, that's it, that information. What do we expand? What do we contract in our curriculum? That process, right? Our chalk and talk, our graphic organizers, our role plays, and our product, when it's beyond a selected response question, an essay question, even thinking about having things in the law school classroom that are presentations, comic strips, dioramas, or even short stories.
Appreciate that. So given that description, do learning preferences, do learning styles, do they fit within that framework? And if so, at what point in your preparation do you give any thought to a particular class's preferences around learning?
Well, I think one way I'm sorry, Jeff, was that for me to jump in? I feel like I was just running the show there. Okay, yeah. So in thinking about it, to me, differentiated instruction is a really good framework for what we would all say is student-centered learning. And we're all really constructivists, right? So the students are really engaged in that. And what differentiated instruction is a reminder that we need to have multiple ways for the students to engage in that material. It incorporates a lot of different learning theories. I'm a huge Howard Gardner multiple intelligences person. I love Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, and it helps me be really strategic about how we're going to go ahead and help students manage their cognitive load, things like that. To me, it has resonance because I like it to think about it as the one-room schoolhouse, right? So in that one-room schoolhouse, we had students of different ages, different interests here, and yet you had one person who was responsible for all of that learning. So how do you manage that time? How do you give something to all of the students so that ultimately they go ahead and leave with something valuable? To Jeff's point, that means that we have a responsibility to get to learn our students. Why are they in our class? What is it they want to accomplish? To me, differentiated instruction starts with day one, where I ask them information about themselves. Many of you may have the students record a recording and upload it to share what they are doing. Maybe you do a student interest survey. Maybe you talk with your admissions folks or academic success, but we're really trying to determine where are they as learners and where do they want to go. So as I shape the syllabus and the learning outcomes, I think about the multiple entry points that people have into my class. I'm coming from wills, trusts, and estates, and I love a good discussion about the tax code. I don't have many students who are there with me at every moment, so I got to figure out what's motivating them about the class. That means I get to vary it from semester to semester based upon the needs, but the students from day one, they realize they have a responsibility. I can learn what they really want to learn, and then I can go ahead and help them shape the semester.
Professor Franklin, I suspect that you employ differentiated instruction techniques in your classroom. Dean Snedden has talked about a couple of approaches she uses. Can you summarize or describe a couple of things that you have done that you found to be effective uses of differentiated instruction?
I mean, I guess to some extent, it's hard for me to separate what is differentiated instruction from what is good instruction. And they're not precisely the same thing. Dean Snedden is being much more specific. And so I do worry that I'm going to be a little too casual and fast and loose with her terminology. But I think, I mean, one of the things that we do know, irrespective of, sort of whether we need to match students' learning styles, whether there is such a thing or not, is that when we're dealing with adults, first of all, we know that doing things in different ways, and even more repeat content, is a great way of ensuring deeper and richer comprehension. It's also true that pushing people to use ways that are not comfortable for them is important. I mean, I think that's the reason it's funny, you characterize Make It Stick as being about sort of everybody's kind of the same, and I don't read it that way, but I do read it as, here are techniques that generally work. And it's certainly true that doing things that you're not comfortable with is a very good way of sort of pushing yourself and advancing your learning and your understanding. It's also true that doing things in ways you are comfortable with is a good way of learning a large amount of information, and that both of those things are true in law school. So I think we need to sort of leave students to do what they need to do. And I think it's really helpful when faculty in all courses, and when academic support people, whether they're teaching the courses or sort of supporting students not in class, encourage people to use different kinds of methods in their study and their learn, including the ones that they prefer and including the ones that they don't. In my classes, I try to provide as many opportunities for that as I possibly can. We have, in my contracts class, we have weekly group assignments that people work on worksheets together. But while they do, I'm walking around the room, as are my TAs, and having conversations. I will grab people's paper and say, yeah, you're doing great here, but you know what? On this one, you guys are way off. Work on that. When I was teaching torts, I haven't taught torts in quite a while, but when I was teaching torts, I realized that my conception of torts, I have a really hard time, maybe I'm a bad law professor, differentiating between what something is a duty and when there's a breach, because it feels to me like they're so integrally interrelated that I can't separate it. And so I gave a problem that was complicated, and I assigned half of my students to duty and breach and half of my students to do causation. And I said, I want you to come in and do a presentation in any manner you want. You can do a music video, you can do an oral presentation, you can do a PowerPoint, whatever you want. One of the most ingenious I saw came from actually a group of students, all of whom were struggling academically, all. And what they came in and did was taught us how to fold origami, and had us all work through this shape while explaining how proximate cause and direct cause were related to one another, and yet they folded back in on each other. It was genius. Now, if you really care about learning styles, you could talk about that being a form of kinesthetic learning that everybody engaged in. But to my mind, that you could also talk about it in 19 other frameworks, including student autonomy or differentiated instruction or. I'm less concerned about what theory it is, and I'm far more interested in the fact that these students brilliantly got and conveyed a thing that I certainly had not conveyed to them before, because these were students who were not doing well in my class.
Nice. I appreciate that. So Dean Sneddon, while I've got you on the line and here in front of, I see 80 participants, I want to curbside you a bit and ask you to apply differentiated instruction to my course this summer. So I'm teaching a class in crim law, and I want to include learning objectives that are specific to professional identity formation. Now, if I'm coming at this from a differentiated learning perspective, at what point do I think about that differentiation? Is it as I create the learning objectives? Are those differentiated? Or does it go to how I actually deliver instruction in the classroom or the instructional environment I set up? Can you help me think about the next steps I should take if I want to differentiate instruction around professional identity formation?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a great question. And I can tell you're a really diligent professor. You're already planning for your summer instruction before this is done. So that's good. As an administrator, I would sort of point out that you want to start with what your institutional learning outcomes are as you kind of situate your individual course outcomes. And then you take a look at your individual class meetings. And so it's kind of like we have these sort of nesting outcomes. To me, I start with the outcomes because to me, that's the destination. So how am I getting students there? What are the pathways? And the pathways are where I start to think about the differentiated instruction. And the pathways will be that content. So what is the content that I need to present or allow the students to engage in? What is the sequencing of that content? What is the pacing of that content? And then what I think about then is what is the process? So what is the range of instructional methods and learning opportunities that I will have to help the students recall, apply, and transfer that understanding? I could compact the curriculum and maybe just do one particular process. I might need to expand it because it's a topic they don't know. And then with the product, this is my favorite part of differentiated instruction because I love a good tic-tac-toe board and learning menu. I think about what is that thing that the students put together? Is it the origami image? Is it a comic strip? Is it a podcast? What is going to be the way that the learner demonstrates to me that they are going to accomplish those learning outcomes? Helps me think about performance criteria, as well as kind of thinking about the measurement. One thing that I would kind of combine, Jeff, because I know you had that question of, okay, what if I have 75 students this summer? And I'm thinking, I don't teach 75 different ways. I didn't want 75 different projects. What can I do? Well, I think we can respect student autonomy with a couple of ways. One would be a learning menu. So you've got your course outcomes, you've got your particular learning module outcomes, and you're thinking of how will students demonstrate competency in those. Well, you can give the students a number of different projects that are going to require them to show that competency. You can have your overall learning outcomes, perhaps it's something with vocabulary and maybe more specific things that are related to the form. And the students can select the choice that appeals to them or that interests them. You could have relevant content that's sort of overarching. My students are doing a learning menu about trust. They can review an intake questionnaire and a trust agreement to write a letter to a client. They can do a community presentation with a handout and a script that goes to the community to talk about trust, or they can record a podcast where they're actually kind of interviewing someone who is thinking about a trust. All of those are going to help them gain the fluency with the vocabulary. It's going to help them compare and contrast trust to other kinds of estate planning devices. And it's also going to help them compose something that reveals, again, their understanding of the different concepts that are related to trust here. You will, in a class of 75, pretty much have a third, and a third. So then you'll have to grade, of course, but you can have different rubrics related to each of them. If you're listening to this and you're thinking there is no way I'm doing 3 different projects, let me posit to you a fun way of doing differentiated instruction that is somewhat low stakes and a lot of fun. So I'm a believer in extra credit because it's a way to lure students to do extra learning in the course, gives them bonus points towards the final exam and so forth. I love a good tic-tac-toe board where you come up with 9 different projects that the students can complete, and they will be actually relatively fun for the students to complete. They need to do 3 in a row in order to get the extra credit. Because it's extra credit, it's somewhat easy for me to grade because they meet my criteria, what I'm actually asking them to do, or they don't. And you can have them do different things. So they could review a recently published law review article on a set series of topics that you've covered. They can then write a comic strip about a particular topic. They can compose a fictional narrative about one of the cases. They can also do other things. Annotate a form agreement that you might provide. Create a 2 to 4 minute recording of Now You Know. Come up with a playlist for what their playlist is going to be when they're studying for the exam. They can record a role play. They could interview an alum. That's a good example of different ways, and we could say learning preferences of what they're engaged with. They can turn them in your course management platform, and they realize that learning is a lot of fun, which is something I always try to say to them, and my 16-year-old daughter rolls her eyes at that, but learning is fun here. And it allows them to do a deep dive on some topics that you may not have covered as much. It allows them to make connections to things that you may not have seen. Including just one of those kind of tic-tac-toe board or the menu choice is a good way of letting students engage with the material in a way that relates to and recognizes their readiness, their profile, and their interests. And it gives them a chance to do some really creative things that will lead to the type of creativity that they need in the practice of law.
Nice. Wow, that is That is very helpful. Professor Franklin, as you listen to Dean Stetton describe that approach, what's your reaction? What are you thinking as you hear her describe the kinds of things that she does in her T&E class?
I love the tic-tac-toe idea. I mean, I love all of it, and I've certainly done many similar things. The reason I'm so drawn to the tic-tac-toe idea, although I think it's interesting, I'm very much not an extra credit person. I'm like, no, you're doing all this because it's required in my class. But you can't put the tic-tac-toe idea together without not only coming up with 9 different things, but in fact, if you have to do a line, there has to be some kind of connection. And the connection could either be that they're all on a common theme, or it could be that they're all on a different theme, so they're hitting different things, but it requires real thought. And to my mind, all of this, we keep talking about learning stuff. For the 20 years I've been hearing and reading people talk about learning styles or student autonomy, this and that, no one talks, all of it is about saying, let us appreciate the students as learners and decenter ourselves. I get that. I think that's right. I think that's what education is all about, and that when we are the most important person in the room, we are doing it wrong. That said, we have to do the thinking ourselves. We have to know, I agree with Dean Stetton, particularly in her dean role, saying start with your institutional learning outcomes, but that doesn't tell you what your learning outcomes are in a particular class. It doesn't tell you what your learning outcomes are in a particular unit in a class. You have to know, why do students struggle with this? What do I want them to get out of it? And the answer can't be because it's the next chapter in the damn casebook. It's got to be because it's there for a reason, or I've opted not to assign it for a reason. And the stuff I am assigning, I care about. And this is why it matters for my students to practice law. I have to say, I honestly and thoroughly believe that very few of my students will ever deeply care about personal jurisdiction. I just don't believe that that's a thing. The vast majority, most lawyers aren't litigators. Most lawyers who are litigators don't do federal practice. Most lawyers who are litigators who do federal practice don't encounter that many personal jurisdiction problems, assuming they have properly effectuated service of process. So why is it that I'm spending time teaching it? It's because it teaches something about how to understand the way that complex sort of policy-driven reasoning and constitutional-driven reasoning relates. And in my school, like many others, although not all, con law is a second-year subject. So I'm the person in civil procedure who's introducing them to how to read and understand constitutional cases in a way that's quite different from, for example, the kind of cases they read in torts that were probably there as examples rather than as leading doctrine that they needed to sort of grasp. So if I know that that's what I'm doing, I should tailor what I'm doing with that in mind. I don't need to obsess over having them state the case if the case is not the goal of the class. I do in a different way if the case is the goal of the class. For the vast majority of first-year classes, the case is not the goal of the class, and students don't know that. But for some, it is. And for con law, it always is. So part of what I need to do is figure out what methods I need that are going to work for the stuff that I'm doing. But that means absolute clarity on what it is that I'm doing and why. The unfortunate thing is that actually takes some experience. And all of us are beginners some of the time in some things we do. I'm uniquely bad at this. I will apparently teach almost anything that anybody asks me to, and it doesn't seem to require any actual expertise on my part. But I'm well aware of the fact that first, I'm going to rely on the expertise of others who've taught it before me, and secondly, I'm going to have to spend my time figuring out not only how do I learn material myself, but what is it that I really care about my students knowing about this material, and what stops them? And then let's come up with different instructional methods that reach that, because part of differentiated learning is using as many methods as possible. But I do want to go back to one thing that Dean Stetton said that I feel like we haven't given enough attention to, since this is posited as focusing on learning styles, which is differentiated instruction, particularly in her work where she's drawing from so much of the work on pedagogy that's dealing with K through 12, is about addressing the fact that everyone approaches learning something with some disadvantages. to compare to other students. And part of differentiated instruction is not simply what do you prefer to learn and what methodologies work better for you. It is recognizing that the goal is they all have to get to meet the same standards, but they're not starting from the same place with respect to those standards. And our classrooms have to accommodate that, because it is unacceptable morally to just say, well, if you don't get it, too bad. That may once have been a common attitude in law school. If that's anybody's attitude now, I would like to show them the door.
Appreciate those comments, Professor Franklin. We've reached the time in the session that I wanted to protect for listeners' questions and comments for the panelists. So I think we'll get started there. I've heard some conversation in the chat around needing to see or think about examples with respect to differentiated instruction. So listeners, as you're thinking about whether you have a question for the panelist, you could put that question in the chat. You could signal with a hand if you want to raise your hand so that we can see it, or you could speak out. I'm also curious, and I'll just pose this question for you listeners. If you have used a differentiated instruction strategy in your classroom, like the tic-tac-toe board, and could just briefly summarize it in the chat, that might be helpful for our listeners as well. So listeners, this is your time. Tell us about a differentiated instruction practice, or ask a question or pose a comment, and Cindy will be monitoring the chat for us.
I did want to say, Jeff, I had seen in the chat, people were like, show me examples. Obviously, I have some examples in the article, but if you email me and I put my information in the chat, I'm happy to send to you what my learning, what my materials are, including the rubrics, because sometimes that's what someone says. How do I go ahead and evaluate them when I do have these different things? So feel free to send me an email. And then when you send me the email, you include too what your differentiated instruction is, and we'll go ahead and share.
Me too. Absolutely. Because I share a lot of my stuff, like when I speak at new law teachers or a few other places. But I don't have a particular compilation, but I'm happy to share everything that I have.
Jeff, we have one question, Mark Hodge.
Thank you very much. First off, thank you both so much for everything that you have imparted today. I think that that these things are so critical, especially at this point in time when we're sort of in a transition mode in so many different directions, whether it's coming out of the pandemic or our own teaching, things. Just so many things are in flux. One thing that I'd like to ask you is, with this idea of the differentiation, how do we reconcile that? Maybe that's not the best word, but how do you apply this in attempting to work with doctrinal professors in terms of the Socratic method, which is somewhat steeped in cookie cutterness? So could you talk about that a little bit? And again, many, many thanks.
Chris, did you want to get started, or did you want me to get started?
I mean, I think we probably both have thoughts about it. I will say, the minute someone tells me that they're using the Socratic method, I still feel like I don't understand what it is that they're doing in class. There are 97 different versions of the Socratic method, and people use Socratic method to mean many, many other things. Some people say Socratic meaning cold calling. Other people say Socratic meaning case focused. Some people mean Socratic is just, I stand in front of the room. True Socratic dialogue in the form of Socrates requires actually, a genuine inquiry into what people think in ways that may not have a preordained outcome. I don't think that happens very much in most law classes. I usually have a pretty clearly ordained outcome that I want to get to. And I think most of us do too. I think that's part of what we think of as being prepared for class. So I think anybody who defines what they're doing as Socratic method and stops is being a little bit lazy about thinking about what their teaching means. So I don't know if that's answering your question or not, but it's enough for me to sort of trash other people and then pass it to Dean Sneddon, who I'm sure will be far kinder than I am.
Well, I do think it's so interesting how we have shorthand phrases that mean very different things to different people, which is kind of like our topic of the day, because I think Socratic method for some people, like Professor Franklin said, it means chalk and talk. It doesn't actually even mean a dialogue at all. But what I would kind of say where someone's like, this is what I'm doing, I would push back and say, it's not about you. It's not about the person at the front of the room. But what you may not realize that you're doing is you are adapting and you are responding, right? How many of us have called on a student and we have thought we know 100% what that student is going to say, and it is something completely different. We get a hand in the air that asks us something about popular media or about a case from last week. Well, what do? We adapt. We respond, we pivot. That is actually kind of what differentiated instruction reminds us, is that of the power dynamic, it's the learners who are going to influence the path under which they're kind of going. So I think when someone says, oh, this isn't for me, the question is, you're already kind of doing it, but maybe not doing it the way that you should. So it's the start of a dialogue with that professor who says, actually, here's how you can do that and make it better.
If I could ping off of that as well, sometimes we all know that sometimes that derails a conversation, but far more often it's some of the best conversation we have in class, right? The stuff that we weren't prepared for, that we hadn't thought about, but that is obviously in our students' minds. It is easy to stand in the front of the room, ask and have a dialogue with one professor and with one student, and get good stuff from that student and assume that everybody else in the room got it and followed all of that. I've had similar conversations, frankly, with clinical teachers and legal writing professors as well. They'll say, well, when I tell my students to do these things, I get better papers. And I'm like, great. Did you get better learning? Because they're not actually the same thing, right? A successful dialogue with a student in class is a terrific, fun, enjoyable experience. But the only people we know have had a successful dialogue are those two people. Now, it may well be that lots of people learn from that, but there's no guarantee that everyone did, which is why I find it almost impossible to talk about differentiated learning, learning styles, or anything I care about learning without also talking about active learning. Now, it is impossible for the deans and the faculty who have to manage rooms of sometimes 75 to 125 students to make everything active all the time. But the more active we make things, the better. And I have had faculty try to explain to me that Socratic teaching is active because they're asking questions and a student is answering it. And I'm willing to concede that it might be active at that moment for the one student who's talking. But I certainly do not concede that it's active for anyone else. And the active thinking that we want them to do, like, oh, I'm going to try to anticipate and imagine what my answer will be, and then I'll correct it and make careful notes if my answer is different than the one the professor indicates was a good one. I mean, we've all been to law school ourselves. If you did that in all of your classes, I have deep admiration for you, but I will tell you, I've been fairly successful in my career, and I sure as heck did not do that in all my classes. So I got to believe that lots of my very smart and very successful students are also not doing that in all of my classes.
Chris, as I listen to you speak, and I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to pose this. As I listen to you speak, I'm reminded of the phrase decoding the discipline, right? Which to me is about helping me understand the mental moves my students have to make to be able to accomplish the learning objectives that I've set for them. And as I think about that, I think about the distinction between experts and novices as they approach subject matter. And as I think about that, I think about how hard it is for me as a person who's been teaching stuff for a while to put myself in the position of a novice. So my question for you panelists, and I think Dean Sneddon, you spoke to this a little bit, how do you, from semester to semester or class to class, re-establish that relationship with your novice self in a way that helps you teach effectively?
Well, I'll start. You become a dean and realize there's so much about the legal education you have no idea. And on a more serious note, it is about putting yourself out there as a learner and putting yourself in the role of novice. For some of us, it's regularly changing our case books or our course materials. So we have to kind of come at it a different way. It's redesigning a project. So we're kind of looking at it. But for some of us, it is getting outside of legal education entirely, going to a conference, completely different discipline where we're kind of open to it. Maybe it's even looking at something on Netflix that you didn't even know you didn't know. I am a huge fan of documentaries. I'll watch a documentary on anything because there's so much that I don't know. And it reminds me to be in that place of a student. Once I enrolled in an exercise course, and boy, talk about humbling and being a novice. Not only did I never go back, but it did make me think that sense of the new, the wonder, the embarrassment, the closing off. And so to me, that keeps it reinvigorating, looking at that new perspective. It's also one thing that's really special about our job. Our students are always changing. When I first started in legal education, it was all about the millennials that are coming, that are going to upend everything. Now we're all worried about Gen Z and what they're doing. That is, I don't believe in generational stereotypes, but remember, I'm Gen X. It doesn't believe in generational stereotypes. So that's one of the things. But it's a shorthand way of saying we need to adapt. We need to respond. It's that encouragement. It's that inquisitiveness. That's what makes great lawyers, right? Intellectual curiosity. And we can put ourselves in that role of novice learners to cultivate that interest, that enthusiasm that we want our students to have.
Yeah, I would add to that, but look, I'm well aware that most law professors don't immerse themselves in learning theory. I mean, I personally think maybe we all ought to a little bit, but at the very least, we have to exhibit curiosity about why students are struggling with material. You know, when I hear professors complain about, like, I said this 14 times and they didn't get it, it's like, well, then that's a thing. You can't just lament. That's a thing you've got to figure out and how to fix, right? I am a fan of bad American television, and one of the things that I'm a fan of in bad American television is the show House. And every time I watch the show House, I think, is there even such a specialty in medicine as diagnostics? I'm not sure there is, but there ought to be. And there ought to be a specialty among us in diagnostics. What is it that is getting in the way of these students mastering this concept? And that's something that all of us in our individual disciplines can be interested in, irrespective of how much learning theory we've read. You don't actually need a language. You don't actually, it's helpful to have it. It's helpful to have that kind of background, but you don't need it. You don't need to be able to explain to someone what Lev Vygotsky was doing or what a scaffold is to understand that if my students aren't getting this, I'm going to need to lead them there more methodically and more slowly. And I'm going to need to figure out what is the block that I can work around. And that's a thing that everyone can do, no matter how much they are or are not immersed in learning theory, because they are and absolutely have to be immersed in their students' learning.
Appreciate those comments. All right, listeners, this last segment of today's webinar is about you. I need you to take some time and reflect on what you've heard today or been thinking about. There's a couple of different things you might do. You might summarize for yourself a key takeaway, something that you're going to hold on to. You might express a commitment to learn more about differentiated instruction, or you might commit to a particular technique or to emailing Dean Sneddon or Professor Franklin to find out more. What I'd like you to do right now, though, I'm going to be quiet. The panelists are going to be quiet. Would you spend some time in reflection? If you want to put your thoughts into the chat, feel free. You don't need to. What's important to me is over the course of the next 2 minutes that you take some time to quietly reflect on what you've heard. Unfortunately, our time is drawing to a close. Have we busted a myth today? I don't know, but I think we've had a really good conversation about pedagogy. I hope that you did take something from it that you can use as you think about your classes for the remainder of the semester, as you approach your teaching for next fall. Panelists, thank you. We know you are busy people with so many things happening and other commitments. That you took the time to be with us today says a lot about your commitment to the section, to the work that this group does. So thank you, and good afternoon to everyone.